Hallo und herzlich willkommen
Good morning and welcome to
Compliance.
our Knowledge Power Days Compliance. I'm really happy to have you here today in our last webinar in our Compliance Month of April. My name is Romana Edelhauser-Preisel and I'm the host today. So our topic today is how to consolidate your entrepreneurial resilience, proactively reducing risks with a standardized onboarding process. And I'm really happy to introduce our expert today, Christian Kellner, who is also my colleague. So hello, Christian. Nice to have you here. Good morning. So before we start, just a couple of pieces of housekeeping, as you already know, but I just need to mention it anyway. So please keep your microphones muted. Please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A function. We'll collate them, and after the presentation, we will answer them. The webinar will be recorded today, and the recording as well as the presentation will be sent out after the long weekend. I think in Germany, Austria and Switzerland, we've got a bank holiday on Monday, so you will have those two items on Tuesday. We've got a simultaneous interpreter with us today, so if you want to listen in English, then please choose your language channel via the globe symbol at the bottom. So that's all from my side. So I'm now going to hand over to Christian. Thank you very much, Romana. So the title has already been mentioned. So my slides have actually been written in English. So if you've heard me in the past or it's only because we have got simultaneous interpretation today with us. So I'm actually usually a fast speaker, but today I'm going to try and speak a little bit more slowly. So today we're going to talk about corporate resilience and standardized onboarding processes and how they can help with that. So we've got some slides prepared for you. So in terms of the agenda for today's event, so we've got 9:30 and 10 o'clock on here, but we'll keep it a little bit flexible. So first of all, we would like to set the scene. So what is the environment we're operating in? So what are the trends? What are the topics we're having to deal with? What are the challenges of our companies today? What are your challenges today in varying degrees? And then we want to talk about how we can become proactive rather than reactive in terms of tackling those problems and how we can and want to do that. Then I've also got a best practice case for you, and I wanted to basically show you a process and how these processes can look. And then we'll have a wrap up and maybe some takeaways from the topic today. So whilst preparing for this webinar, I was just thinking about what the challenges are today. What are the topics we're having to deal with? What are the drivers? And these may not apply to you, at least not all of them, but these are some of the topics that we're all facing as society, as corporations. So let me just give you a brief overview here. So it's started with COVID, of course. So the last few years, we've had the consequences of COVID, and it's had an impact on how we do business as well. And it was so relevant, and it was interesting to see what type of relevance a pandemic could have on today's globalized world, and it's actually still relevant today, sadly. So it's still causing stress, and especially on health systems as well. So it's also shown where our weaknesses are in our globalized world. And in many areas, we've had to really rethink. We've had to go from offshoring to onshoring to mitigate those risks. Also in terms of the globalized supply chain, then transparency, we've had to, we really had to get to know our suppliers, and then market sourcing, digitalization of processes. So that's really had a huge upturn here. Then we've got the situation in Russia and Belarus as well, the Ukraine war. So this also has an impact on all our processes. So of course, this is still ongoing, unfortunately. So also the sanctions that have been put in place also on financial institutions are still being felt. So global capital markets are being restricted. So there are restrictions all over the place. So we've also got the topic of a taxonomy. So how do we as a society and as a European Union deal with this taxonomy? How are we going to finance everything? How are we going to introduce new financial streams? So it's also, it's a complete reworking of the existing systems. So there have been financial streams that have been in place for decades, and they have to be rerouted now. And it's a good process also to rethink governance as well. So in Germany, we're having to deal with that. In Europe, we've got corporate sustainability, and there's a draft for the due diligence obligations in the supply chain as well now. So we've still got data privacy topics, so GDPR, so the directive of the European Union, and how it's applied on transparency registers, for example. So how companies have access to all of this data, and how can they understand who is authorized to have access as well. Then we've got monetary policy, inflation, and another topic that haven't even put on here, but in the last few months was really present everywhere, was artificial intelligence as well. So there's a lot of trends, a lot of risks that we're having to deal with, and what we see with our customers as well. If we find risks or new events, then this is the way we take action usually. So that's quite simple, really. So usually there may be a new regulatory framework, for example. So we've got new risks that we're having to deal with. So we interpret and take relevant actions for our business. So we're reacting, and ideally, and I just want to put that in brackets, so to speak. So ideally, we'll monitor these activities as well. So we will monitor the impact of the event and the consequences, whether it's the COVID pandemic or a war. So we'll monitor the situation, but it's usually a reaction first, and it's not so much being proactive. And so the message today is really of how we can become more proactive. So I know this is a little bit of a cumbersome picture, the iceberg, but usually it's a challenge of data availability. Have we got the right data? Are they correct? So above the water, we've got the suppliers, the customers, we know them all, we know our third parties, our partners. So those are the ones we're doing business with. And then below the water, it's a little bit more complicated. So this is about identifying regulatory risk. We need to understand who are the authorized persons of our partners. Then there's cyber risks we need to understand. And then we've got a hugely complicated supply chain as well. So we need to understand what the risks are within that supply chain. So there's always fraud and there's other risks like that. So there's so many dimensions. So it's sometimes really difficult to recognize those risks, and there are different risks. So we've got some risk factors here. So what is really important here is to realize that risk factors are really customized, so to speak, individual. So there are risks, for example, that affect particular regions or countries. So the corruption levels in some countries, or money laundering trends, labor conditions, conflicts, wars, but also environmentally relevant factors or risks. So these are individual risks. So it just depends on where your business is, in which industry you're operating, what products you're dealing with, and what products bring value to you. So we've got, again, in terms of the products, we've got dual use, we've got money laundering trends. So sometimes there's a higher money laundering risk in terms of services. Then we've got the quality of products, the demand for products. And in services and industry, as I've already mentioned, so labor conditions are quite specific in some industries that are more risky. For example, let me just think of one, for example, in garments. So the garment industry, so there's modern slavery, there's child labor. So sometimes there can be very customer specific risks. So we need to verify our customers as well. Then there's ownership structures, addresses. Are there any risks in free trade zones, for example? Have I got to deal with PEP sanctions? And then there's other topics, cyber risk. And in our world where systems are more and more interconnected and exchanging data more and more, it is even more relevant to understand what risks and what cyber risks I have. For example, if I am connected with my suppliers and if my system is connected with them, and how up to date their system is as well. So we need to really know our clients and our suppliers as well. So these risks are very individualized. So every risk is tricky, especially for some regions, and they're relevant to differing degrees in the different countries or regions and industries. So it's actually helpful to cover the entire range of risks that we have, especially with so many market partners as well. So that's why we need a standardized onboarding process in order to recognize and analyze those risks. So that's basically what we're going to show on the next slide here. So how can we become proactive rather than reactive? So we need to, of course, deal with problems and risks and react to them, but how can we become more proactive as well here? So if we go from the top right, so we've got onboard, monitor, manage. So assess. Let's talk about assessing first. So what are the drivers of higher risks? So for example, in my supply chain, so my direct suppliers. So who supplies goods to my company, and to what degree are those products involved in wars, in child labor, in environmental risks, for example, forest fires or flood. So what are the risks here in my supply chain? Are there maybe sanctioned owners in the structure as well? So we really have to take some time with all the departments involved and to define what the risks are and what risks we need to look at when we onboard a new client or a new supplier. So an example here, so that's actually very well known, but I think it's, so in Patagonia, for example, it's a clothing company that's really into environmentally in sustainability and labor conditions. So they've got an onboarding process where 4 departments are involved. So procurement, we've got quality assurance, sustainability experts, and another team that really is looking into the labor conditions of their suppliers. So after an assessment of various questions, they decide whether they onboard the supplier or not. So that's one example. So it's just broken down to whether it's a yes or a no. But it's so there are several departments that have to be involved in this process. So there's a whole catalog of criteria that has to be fulfilled in order to do business with that company. Then we've got the onboarding process. So we need to decide what the risk appetite is. So where is the limit between being exposed to a risk versus the challenge of actually wanting to grow? And how am I going to integrate my business partners in my ecosystem? So what level of transparency am I setting, and what am I expecting of my suppliers, for example, in terms of exchanging data and in terms of third parties? So there are, again, questionnaires that suppliers have to fill in, and there needs to be a certain level of transparency that enables me to do business well and to do business in a way that enables me to operate well. So we need to gather the right information from our suppliers. And then at the right-hand side, at the bottom, we can see we need to make the right technology investments as well in terms of the data. So we need to access to the right systems that enable that process as well. And then we need to continuously monitor. So via internal systems, external systems, and ideally, and I know this is really difficult, but we need to understand how the risk of my clients, of my suppliers, so we need to basically understand the supply chain and how risk prone my supply chain is. So this is the so-called end-to-end mapping. So we need to understand our main customers, our main suppliers as well. So because I depend on them in terms of my own value creation. And last but not least, we need to manage everything. So we need to stress test, and ideally we also need to identify alternative suppliers. So that's the famous plan B. So just in case, so if somebody can't supply anymore, we need to then find alternative suppliers, and hopefully they will also already be onboarded as well. So this is a standardized process for all clients and all suppliers. So in summary, so we need to assess our business partners, we need to monitor them, we need to manage risk. So especially if there's new risks that are identified. So we need to have the input of all the involved departments, and they need to identify new risks. It could be new regulation, it could be wars. And if we're just coming back to the supplier, the supply chain as well, so we are not asked to proactively look at the supply chain at the moment in Germany, but we're only asked to be proactive here if there is a known case of non-compliance here in the supply chain. But we need to understand the risks within the supply chain as well. So we will never be able to eliminate all risks, but by involving all those teams and by introducing a structured risk assessment, we can be flexible, and we have the necessary maneuverability in order to tackle those risks that we've just identified. And the first step in this process is to understand the supplier better, or the business partner. So we've got the so-called identity resolution functionality here. So it's a product, it's a functionality name, which describes the ability to use data sources and to collate all the information and paint a specific picture. So we've got three sources, maybe they may be independent from one another. So the first one could be, for example, an open list, an ARP statement. Maybe we have a credit limit for the customer. Maybe we have we've got overdue invoices. Then it could be a product database, that could be another source, for example, an ordering system, and then there's another source, for example, it could be a contact, or it could be a CRM entry as well. So it could be something that's come up through a conference or a meeting. So we've got these three data points. They're kind of parallel, but they all take us to the one company. So these are all fake data, of course. But so we can collate them, and then we've got the UNS number. So it's a global key that we assign to this company, and then we enter all the data points, for example, address, phone number, industry code. So that's a process of how we identify the business partner. We rationalize and standardize the name, for example. So this is all based on registers, so we can categorize the addresses as well. And then the second step, so this is basically just to understand of who is behind my business partner. So we've got 3 ways of looking at them here. So the first 2 steps are to understand how we can link customers, and so this is basically an entire entrepreneurial structure here. So we can look at it top down, and so we've got the global ultimate Duns. So that's basically the highest level company, and then underneath that, depending on the group structure, we've got different subsidiaries. So it's a family tree basically, and then we've got a bottom-up view as well. So we've got here the look. We're looking at people. So this is to look at who's authorized. So maybe we have company A, and then we can see who is the owner of company A. So this is about all the links between different people, between different companies. So from a global perspective, this is a problem because there are registers. For example, in Germany, we've got a different register from China or South America. So there's different registers that don't communicate with one another. So maybe we've got Christian Kellner in one of them. He might be the owner in the Chinese register, or an authorized person in another register. So we're trying to standardize this via our network functionality. So we have a people-centric view, and we'll try to establish that. So we'll link Christian Kellner across borders, and then we can identify the overall risk for that person, for example. So we've tried to visualize this here. So the big circle here, that's me. So that's the person. So it could be the owner director of one company. Sorry, I was just distracted a minute. And it could be the director of a company in Austria, and so on. So this is what it looks like. So this is top down. So that's a real example, which I mean, this could be out of date by now, but this is our corporate linkage here. So the global level is at the top. So that's the mother company with headquarters in Moscow. Then we've got the subsidiaries as well, and they can have other subsidiaries. So we've got the family tree. So we usually start at the top, and then it goes down. So it could be several thousand companies globally for one group. So sometimes those trees can be huge. And then this is the other view here, which is a little bit more complex. So we're starting here at the bottom. So this is a company at the bottom. So it's Rosneft Holding. And then we're looking at the ownership structure from the bottom up. So there are companies here that have got ownership here. So you can also see the links here. Sometimes there are circular relationships as well. And then we can see the owners as well, people that have shares directly or indirectly in the company. So this is another look at the authorized persons. So what we can't see here, and that's what I've mentioned earlier, so that's the people-centric view again. So for example, we've got the ABC Limited here. So we've got some trees here. If you think back to the previous slide, so there's 3 people here that are indirect owners via different links, and this is from the register in Germany, in Singapore, and Spain. And there are owners, for example, that sound like they are the same person. We don't know 100% that they are the same person, but we know that John Smith owns 12% of ABC Limited via those links, and that's the equivalent for all the other 2 persons as well here. And then we can aggregate the data. Of course, it's quite easy here because I've got the similarity in the name. Maybe I've got a date of birth as well, but there are algorithms we can use, and that enables us to also understand across borders of how people are linked, and then we can identify whether it is the same person or not. So one of the customers, so this just takes us into the best practice part a little bit as well. So one of our customers that's already using these tools and that we're analyzing currently is an aviation company. So that's a group of national airlines, the maintenance services that are working with the airline and the services company. So when they saw the situation in 2022, so they were identifying the risk, and they wanted to identify where there are links to Russian owners in their supply chain. So where there is Russian investment in our supply chain because of the sanctions. So that was the driver for that project. So we've used risk analytics, and the customer was able to identify the authorized persons, that he was able to understand the structures. And what was relevant here as well was to get an overview into the ESG rankings and to understand how sustainable these companies work. So whether they respect social laws, etc. So we have optimized the compliance process as well, and also automated supplier verification as well. So that's the next step really for that company. So they have you've probably read the statement here, so I'm not going to read it again to you now, but basically the customer had a challenge. They were using the possibility to not just identify Russian capital, Russian involvement, which was a regulatory requirement, but also to look at other risk points in the onboarding process. So this was a desired process. So they proactively wanted to engage in that process. So just to show you the process again in an abstract manner. So this is our classic workflow here. So on the left-hand side, we're looking for a business partner. It could be a supplier or a client. So we identify them. Then in the yellow box, we've got the onboarding process. So it's the identification, then risk assessment. So here we said solvency risks, so credit risks, or that was the big point there. And then we've got the compliance check. So there's different information that flows. So that's the purple boxes at the top. So we've got a policy, for example, that defines of what we need to identify our suppliers. So what data do we need? What databases do we need? Which data streams are we using as well? So in order to have standardized data in our system. So we've got the activity status as well. And then there's other information, for example, that you can see here. Then we will have the risk assessment. So that's something we were talking about in the last 20 minutes. So basically the risk, that means a solvency risk. So there's usually a score or a rating, and then we can recognize particular events. And we've got data sources, for example, statements, financial information, and then we can know what the liquidity is with that partner, because we obviously want to engage in a long-term relationship. Then we've got the compliance risk as well, regulatory requirements and reputational risk. So it's also about the ethos as well. And that's, again, a very individual and specific risk, because we have to decide which companies and which people you want to be in relationship with. So there's also sanction lists, there's PEP lists as well. So there could also be negative reporting in the media as well. So we need to include that into our monitoring process as soon as the business partner has been onboarded. And that's that's the motive here. And in order to come back to the assess, monitor, onboard, and manage. So we've got different processes that you can integrate here. So we can maybe have an ESG ranking threshold. So we've got so via Dun Bradstreet, you can get information of how sustainable the company is, maybe in terms of social aspects. So whether the company works in terms of ESG, whether they're sustainable or not. So there's a ranking of 1 to 5. So you can use those. So rankings 4 and 5 can be excluded, for example, automatically. So if they don't comply, then you can exclude them. And then in terms of the risks, you can also look at ESG risks, which may not be as important for my clients as it is for my suppliers. And then there's ESG rankings, and I can actually also include them in my due diligence check. And if the data isn't sufficient, then I can also ask for the data from my customers. I can send questionnaires, for example, and then I can include that data into my risk assessment process again. So ESG is just one example here. So I can also look at cyber risk indicators. I can also look at external data that identifies the risk. For example, if we're talking about cyber security, I can also look at climate factors. I can look at liquidity factors. So we need to involve different departments again, and to see maybe how the quality assessment works and what standards are expected from my suppliers as well. So what we think about the quality, and that can also be included in the process. I can also have indicators in terms of fraud and corruption. I have a country list, for example, with high-risk countries and low-risk countries. So this is the process. And this also helps us to standardize the process, and it's actually not too difficult to get additional data as well. So this is my last slide now. So there are risks you have to tackle tactically. So if they're extraordinary, so if they're short-term and sudden risks, but a lot of companies only have that tactical way of working. So they have a risk, then they need to understand, for example, if we look at the war in Ukraine and sanctions on Russia, then we need to understand who is behind my business partners. There are maybe limits on capital streams from Russia, for example. What are the sanctions? How exposed are my business partners to sanctions? So we can get that data from external databases as well, and then monitor that. And if you have any hits here, for example, then you can take action. So that's basically the tactical way of working or reactive way of working. Then the strategic way of working or proactive one. So that's what we've been looking at. So that's basically, so you can never eliminate risks altogether. We all know that. So we have here the opportunity to minimize risks or the impact of risks. So this is by using a standardized onboarding process, and we can include all aspects of business, and we can use that framework. We can reflect our risk appetite. You can reflect the anticipated regulatory changes. And I can start now to basically include those anticipated regulatory changes in my onboarding process. And then I have the right type of framework to comply with all these regulatory changes. So whether they're already in place or not, but if they're anticipated, I can take precautions here. And then, of course, I can also reflect ethical standards. So this increases my maneuverability, especially in uncertain times. And it also enables me to have a plan B in place. So if I have to identify alternative suppliers and bring them closer as well. So there's maybe 3 final points. So to have a clear data strategy is really important. So of how to get data or get the relevant data, because of course this also depends on internal data, but also on external data. And then to keep data up to date, that's my second point. And thirdly, what's really important as well is to communicate with clients, with suppliers, and to build trust, because those trusted relationships are the ones that you can rely on most in uncertain times. So that's all from me now. So I'm not sure whether we have questions now or whether we've come to the end. Romana, yes, we have got some questions. So the first one is this. So you were mentioning cyber risks. So what are you offering here specifically? So cyber risk, of course, is a topic that's only increasing in importance. So we're cooperating with one of the leading providers of security scorecards. So this includes those dimensions, the vulnerability, for example, of companies. So they analyze companies' vulnerability, and then they have a data set available. So it's similar to what we have for ESG risks or financial risks. So that partner has analyzes how vulnerable different partners are. So there's a scale of 1 to 100. So that really helps in our onboarding process as well. So if you have a threshold of 70 or 80, for example, and if they're below that, then they won't be onboarded. So they will be automatically excluded. But also we can say that we can say there's a problem and we expect that you take these actions, for example, and then once they've been resolved, then we can perhaps do business. Thank you. Next question. So how does the collation of persons across registers and countries work exactly? Well, so please correct me if I didn't understand the question correctly. I can't really describe this because I'm not a mathematician or statistician, but it's a very complex system. So it works with plausibilities and probability. So if there are similar names, then that's easier. And if there are different links that we can combine, then that's easy. But there's a lot of indicators that we use in order to establish probabilities. So it's never 0 or 1, for example. So it's not black and white. So we can say, oh, we know the owners of a company in Vienna, for example, because they're registered officially. But when it's across borders, then we have to work with probabilities. And then we can distinguish between things that are highly probable and so it's highly probable it's the same person or not. But I'm not mathematically involved enough here. So it would be good to involve the experts here. So next question, from your point of view, what is the most important thing in establishing a standardized onboarding process? What is the first step? It's a very good question. I thought I had mentioned it a little bit. So for me, it's two things. So first of all, we need to understand who my customers and suppliers are. So there needs to be some master data in the system because you need to make the right decisions and not the wrong decisions. So that's also important when you analyze your existing supplier portfolio. So we can help here. And secondly, it might be an internal task in the companies to involve different departments and maybe have a workshop and then to break down what the risks are, which areas do we need to look at and assess before the onboarding process. So it could be maybe the legal department, marketing, etc., to define that catalog. So that's the foundation. And that's actually in one of my first slides. So the risk factors are really individual and they're multifaceted. So they don't not every risk factor applies to every company. So you need to really have internal partners as well and involve other departments from within the company. How do you deal with the European transparency register? Do we still have access to operators? So yeah, this is about data privacy, isn't it? So the European Court of Justice had a decision last year. So we've got a different access to transparency register. So depending on the country, there's different levels of accessibility. So we've got our database as well. So this is a calculation as well. And we collate register data. So for our database, we don't use transparency register. So it can be additional information. But what we offer is an independent collation of economic operators. So we actually sometimes know from talks that sometimes it's difficult to identify the authorization of people even within a company. So it depends on the legal format of the company. So who is responsible for what? That's actually very difficult. So it depends on how the transparency register functions as well. So sometimes we go into the trade registers or the company register. So there's different ways of approaching that. I don't think we've got any other questions for now. So I would like to say that if you have any questions later on, you can contact Mr. Kellner. So please bombard him with any questions you may have or just connect with him on LinkedIn. Thank you very much, Christian, again for your slow-mo presentation. I hope it worked. So thank you very much. As we've already said, the recording and the presentation will be sent to you per email after the weekend. So thank you for being with us today, and I hope you have a lovely weekend. See you again soon. Bye-bye.